Don't tell anybody.
Good afternoon. My name is Courtney Brown. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan and presenting the Soccer Analytics panel. I'm honored to introduce our guests to you today. We have Gab Marcotti, senior writer for ESPNFC.com, Blake Wooster, CEO and founder of the 21st Club, Paul Carr, senior researcher for ESPN Analytics, Chris Anderson, author of The Numbers Game and managing director of the Coventry City Football Club, and Devin Pluler, manager of analytics for the Toronto Football Club. And we have our moderator today is Andrew Reeby, senior editor of MLSsoccer.com. The panel will run for 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question, please use the hashtag SoccerAnalytics on Twitter, and the most mentioned and retweeted comments will be selected for Q&A. I hand it off to Andrew now.
All right, thank you. There's more people here than there were last year. That's a good sign, I think. I'm glad to be here and glad to have these fine five gentlemen in front of me. As she said, use the hashtag. Any help doing my job would be much appreciated. But let's start with something kind of simple and straightforward, guys. A year ago, we sat on this panel, or some of us did, and went through some of these things. But Blake, I'll start with you. In the last year, what has changed about your job? What has changed about the industry? What is new and different? What should we be looking out for? What have we learned?
Okay, hi everyone. Nice to be here. I'll keep it quite simple, I guess. I'll go with acceptance. I wasn't here last year, so it's all relative, right? But look at Devin. Obviously, was working at a data company, is now working at an MLS club. You got a professor turned author turned managing director of a football club in England, and these guys are writing great stuff using analytics. I'm not sure that would have happened 12 months ago. So I just think we've reached a real tipping point in soccer analytics, and I just think it's a really, really exciting space to be in at the moment, a really exciting industry. So I'll go with we're starting to get that acceptance, I think.
Chris, do you think acceptance has bled over into the development side, the progress in the actual work? Have we seen advances on that side?
Probably not as much as you would always hope for. I would agree mostly with Blake on what seems to have happened is now all of a sudden you have these folks with an interest in this area or an ability in this area take responsibility within football clubs. I'd mention also clubs like Midtjylland and Brentford Football Club. There's sort of a number of sort of projects out there in the world that people aren't laughing at anymore, that they aren't necessarily sneering at anymore, and it's sort of become part of the landscape. In terms of the research that's being done, obviously there's sort of a public side to it, there's a private side to it. The private side is represented by people like Devin. He'll never tell you what he's actually working on, together with Brett over there, right? And other people in other clubs. So what we can really only comment on is sort of what's coming out publicly, what we see being done in the public sphere. I'd say there's certainly a whole lot more of it that's much more varied. It's kind of hard to keep up with sometimes, to be perfectly honest with you. Has there been sort of an epic breakthrough? I don't think so, but it's really not that important right now. I think what we're starting to get to is more a point of where there are some tools that are accepted, that are communicated, that people are aware of, that they can build themselves inside clubs and then come to use. I think the point of, we're getting it to the point where we have some tools, now the trick is to actually use them.
Gab, on the public side, and obviously you're very public-facing in your work, have you seen an increased demand from consumers, from editors, from the folks that you're working with and providing information to for use of these numbers in your work or your colleagues?
I don't think there has been much of an increased demand in terms of the sort of very mainstream work. What there has been is a lot of media organizations is they've realized that there is a subset of the fans who want to think in those terms and who maybe are getting trained to think in those terms, and it's often younger people, so that could lead to a change further on. One thing that makes things difficult, and it's like this in the media and it's like this with clubs, is analytics is a very broad term, and I think there's also a lot of bad use of analytics and bad use of stats, and that becomes an instant turnoff. You know, sometimes if you watch the Champions League coverage or you watch, you know, La Liga, you'll see that, you know, we're stuck in La Liga, like they had sort of the average speed of each Real Sociedad player and each Osasuna player or whatever, and I think to myself, is this, you know, Chris is laughing, I mean, unless you guys all tell me actually this is extremely relevant, you know, but it's out there and we in the media, we talk about it as if it were something important when it's like, you know, 6 against 5.8 or whatever, and I think that tends to confuse the conversation.
Devin, I think soccer in particular, we talk about acceptance and the mainstream nature that it's becoming to get from folks around the world. Sure. But the actual use cases within clubs are very different. You're in a unique position on this panel in that you're very much kind of on that front line with coaching staffs and front office providing information. What have you seen change in the last year and what they're asking for and what they understand and what you're able to provide them and how that perhaps helps them make decisions?
I mean, I think there's a remarkable appetite for this kind of stuff, right? And I'm not speaking just as you know, an employee of this particular club. I see a lot of teams across the planet trying to wrap their heads around this, but it's difficult because they've never kind of done it before. There's never really a club incumbent that is really qualified to, you know, have these kind of conversations. So it makes it really hard to bring in these analysts, right? So, I mean, that I think is changing rapidly, but it's still a significant amount of work that needs to be done there.
Blake, in your work on the consultancy side, you're hiring analysts. Previously, you've done the same. What are you looking for? I'm sure there's a lot of people in this audience that would like to know exactly what they can put down and what experience they can gain in order to break into this industry, because as Devin said, there is an appetite. People want qualified individuals that can do this work. Maybe they can't always identify them.
Yeah. I think speaking from our experience, you know, we probably look for EQ as much as we do IQ. So, you know, ability to build rapport, to ask the right questions, to understand the situation. I mean, we're incredibly lucky at 21st Club, and I'll embarrass him because he's in the crowd, but we have a guy, Omar Chowdhury, and just, you know, 24-year-old, he's been with the business now for a couple of years, and just an outstanding ability to, you know, you put him in front of a CEO as a 24-year-old, he sits there, he asks questions, understands the problem, you know, and then he's got the fantastic capability in terms of statistical modeling capability to obviously deliver the insight, really. So I think we look for EQ as much as we do IQ, but then when it comes to, I guess, the technical capability itself, I think one of the kind of future requirements that I see evolving in the industry is, I think if the statisticians out there, if they can kind of fuse that capability with coding capability, I think that will certainly give them an edge in the future. But we'd much rather recruit you know, a fantastic analyst with an average model than the inverse of that. So EQ before IQ when it comes to.
I think you see in soccer, young people are driving a lot of different areas and progress. We're talking about what's going to happen next. Chris, how does that snowball start? Because I think we saw in basketball and baseball, once mainstream acceptance was gained, you started to see a real drive forward and use cases in the way people were interpreting data and building models and working with clubs and making a difference and helping make decisions.
Yeah, if you think about the history of what we've done in soccer, and it's very similar to other sports, is that the advantage used to be in collecting information. There used to be clubs that were collecting data and clubs that weren't collecting data. And if you had data, that was sort of a leg up. Now everyone's got data, everyone's got laptops, everyone's got everything. That's not the differentiator. That's not interesting. What's interesting is what you do with it, as Blake was alluding to, figuring out where in the club you can make it productive. And to do that, you have to kind of figure out what are the main decisions as a club that you want to make. And to me, analytics is almost a bit of a misnomer from where I sit in the job that I have to do every day. It's more about evidence-based management is how I like to think of it. Is when you have to make key decisions in the football club on any level. Do we think or do we know? Can we put some data against that in order to figure out what might be the better decision over a less good decision? That doesn't have to be super sophisticated, but figuring out what those decisions are and then putting together a process that allows for input from all kinds of sources into that decision, that's really key. And then figuring out, okay, what are the kinds of people that you need in order to get that process going? That's the trick, really.
I'm going to put you on the spot here. What decisions are you making that you lean on? What sort of numbers are you using? What has it changed?
Right. Anyway, so the key, I don't make any decisions, first of all. The manager makes all the football decisions. The technical director makes all the football decisions. My job is to make sure they have the resources to make those decisions. And they're primarily around the stuff we all know, pre-match, post-match analysis, recruitment. And, you know, for me, analytics is interesting because it helps take some of the emotion out of the decision making. It's an incredibly emotional industry, and lots of decisions are made on the back of emotion and their results and short-term kinds of performances. And I think what analytics helps me with is to kind of keep my head and take a step back and say, right, what is it we're doing well? What is it we're doing badly? What are the questions we need to ask? What are the puzzles about our performance, rather than be driven by the results in the short term? That's where it's kind of a really good gut check and a reality check.
Paul, how do you use it in your day-to-day? And I think that emotional side is something that analysts can fall, a television analyst or a journalist can fall susceptible to as well. I mean, you see a game and you think you see something. How does it help you do your job at ESPN?
It gives us more options, you know. I think the rise of soccer analytics and soccer advanced stats has kind of been a slow push over the last several years. So a few years ago, hey, we're getting, you know, things like passes completed and touches on graphics or verbal mentions or something. And you keep pushing these things, and eventually they kind of give in to us, and they're willing to use them more. And then it's, all right, what else can we do? And maybe we can use expected goals and get that on a graphic to try and tell the story of a game a little bit more. So we're always just trying to add a little more context. Arsenal plays a 0-0 game against Southampton. They outshoot them a lot. We can also throw expected goals and show that they had 3.5 compared to 0.5 for Southampton. It's another way of expressing the dominance. We're telling a story that people see, or sometimes it's one they don't see, and just trying to put it there in a very simple way for everyone to understand.
I'm going to throw this out to you guys because we're talking about, what's available to analyze in the data sets, and a lot of that is proprietary, and you have to pay large amounts of money to have access to that. It seems like in baseball, much of that was available. Maybe not the algorithms and the advanced stats behind it, but you had opportunities for people to play around with the data and advance the field without being a person who's being paid by a club or by a media organization or whoever it might be. I'll throw it out to all of you, and whoever wants to jump in. Is there value to be gained by opening up some of these data sets? Sorry, Gus, adopted my bad man.
I used to think that. I don't think that anymore. It's become so easy to collect information. It's become so easy to do something with information, relatively low tech. And I'm also not a believer in particularly sophisticated modeling. It's great when people advance the field and have a PhD in physics from Harvard and they run the most amazing thing that I can't get my head around. But truthfully, there's a lot of insight and a lot of actionable insight to be gained from relatively simple data. So to me, that doesn't seem to be the crux of it at all. It's trying to connect the data we have with what has to go on operationally in the club day to day or week to week, season to season, transfer window to transfer window.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I mean, in my own experience, when we were at Prozone, if ever we got a compelling business case from someone that was looking to access data to solve a problem, then it was no problem really to release obviously you couldn't release any specific club data, but in terms of giving access to data sets, the same, Opta do some great stuff. They do some, forums in London, and, they release data sets to enable people to play around with this stuff. I was with a few MLS clubs over the last few days, and they're crying out for capable people to come to them with great ideas. And, I don't think they'd have any. I'm not sure access is the issue. When Chris already spoke about the kind of diminishing value of, of access. So I think we overplay this access problem sometimes. I think, for anyone looking to get into the industry, if they go to a club or to a data company with a compelling business case around a problem that they want to solve that no one else has done before, I'm not sure it's too hard to get hold of the information anymore.
I think it slows it down a little bit more at kind of a general fan level, a macro level. Fans might not be able to find online, whatever, very easily, just whether it's things like passes completed or more advanced stats like expected goals or whatever models that clubs are using. So I think some of that slows it down for the big fans who can't just go browse things or maybe take some of that data and do stuff on their own. I don't think it slows it down for clubs, for some media outlets, for things like that within the profession. But I think it limits the, I don't know, outsiders may not be the right term, but just your average fan who maybe doesn't really want to get into it and put the work or money into it, but is just kind of curious a little bit about what is this? It's a little bit harder for them to find.
So what I'm hearing in a sense is that theoretical, maybe we're not at that point of really being able to leverage that. Maybe it's the simple stuff that we still have a lot of progress to make. Do you see that in your day-to-day, Devin? Is it too much to go to, say, someone with, some of the research papers that we've seen here that are incredible work, but maybe the coaching staff isn't able to actually turn that into actionable items because either they don't understand it or it's not speaking to the way that they want to work?
Sure. I don't think, just looking at the years past that we've seen of, research papers in soccer, I really couldn't put any of these things in front of our coaches, right? But at the same time, they are trying to answer interesting questions. We just try to answer them probably in as simple of a way as possible, right? It's building sophisticated models and using them to create value in your club, but at the same time, keeping them simple enough that you can explain them. If you can't explain them to these coaches and they can't use them, then there's no value in the added sophistication of these models. So it's a constant kind of balancing act that you need to hit in order to actually make this stuff useful.
Can you give me an example of ways that you distill data and give it to coaches in ways that they want it? Are they asking you questions? Are they asking you for certain reports? Are you coming to them with something and working off that? How do you actually make a difference with the guys making the decisions?
Yeah, it's a constant back and forth, right? Coaches, as they were soccer players usually, they tend to be kind of visual learners. Therefore, a lot of our reports become very data viz heavy and things like that. And those are great because they're incredibly data dense, documents that they can consume a lot of information very, very quickly, right? And then that starts additional conversations. Why is it looking like this? And then it allows me to dig into other things like that. So you kind of, you provide them as much information in as a rich way as possible to kind of get their reactions on it, get their insight on that, and that allows you to start conversations to then dig deeper on specific things.
Like you said, EQ was important, and I think that's a very good point, and communication is crucial. How do you see it in more maybe up the ladder a little bit in the front office structure? What are they looking for? What's the best way to communicate with people at the boardroom level?
I just think it's really important we get the phraseology right, because I think everyone in this room is probably pretty familiar with talking about expected goals, and we can all compare models and all that type of stuff. But there's still our core audiences. I mean, we work with a lot of boardrooms and investors in clubs, but one anecdote, we're all comfortable with using that language, but you take someone like Tim Sherwood when he left Aston Villa. I don't know if you guys saw, it was that great quote when he left Aston Villa, and he was talking about, these guys, this fraternity are talking about expected goals. It's utter nonsense. What are they talking about? Yet here's a guy in his post-match interviews that will talk about, we created the best chances in the game, but I just didn't think we got the result that we deserved. And so there's a clear disjoint between, that's like the definition of expected goals, right? And obviously the ironic thing is, when he was at Aston Villa, bottom of the table, they were incredibly unlucky, right? They were performing better than the league table was lying. And so he got fired at a time when expected goals was telling him, actually, Tim, you're doing okay. So, I think, we just need to get the phrase right. When we're working with boardrooms, you just got to put it into language that they understand. So, if we continue to perform this way, probabilistically, how many times would we win that game, or where are we going to finish in the league table? What does that bias in terms of points? What does that bias in terms of commercial revenue? So you just got to kind of take them on that journey, really. But
yeah, no, just to back up what Blake said, in my experience of talking to people, there's an obvious gap there, and I think it has to do, certainly in Europe, perhaps less so in MLS, because maybe more of the ex-players here. I know a guy like Jesse Marsch went to Princeton, so he may be a dumb jock to some degree, but he presumably, understands what a standard deviation is. In Europe, where I live, it's not like that. In Europe, most cases, even highly intelligent people who become footballers, they generally don't do any real schoolwork after the age of 16. And there's almost like an education gap. And last year, I hooked up with two people I know who are extremely well connected, and we sort of did like a minor survey of Premier League clubs, and we counted how many had managers who actually listened, since almost every club had like an analytics guy or somebody they called an analytics guy. Some had many, and they said, all right, what clubs do these people actually engage and have conversations with them and pay any attention to them whatsoever? And it was just, we came up with 2 managers. Now, maybe that others are being extremely clever and they're not giving anything away, but the reality is there are many people who work for football clubs who maybe get their job because they can make a presentation to a chief executive or whatever, or an owner, but then when they're in there, they get reports and the manager just kind of smiles and puts them in his desk. And these are often intelligent managers, but it's creating that, it's filling that sort of gap. And I don't know if there's scope for some sort of continuing education for managers, or an analytics retreat or something where they can actually clear their minds, not in season, but you can actually go back and teach them certain basics so that they can understand how you guys get to the models. They understand the logic behind it, even if they don't fully grasp the math.
Chris, I saw you nodding through much of that. What were you thinking?
Yeah, I was just thinking, the only alternative to that I can think of, so unless you have a continuing education program for highly sort of busy people under pressure all the time, is if there are people that they really trust and that they can really talk to. So I think going back to the IQ, so it's about those trusting working relationships. And if you don't have those, it really doesn't matter what you do on the analytics side. Because these are highly sensitive, defensive people oftentimes who are worried about their job. The average tenure of a Premier League manager is 14 months, something like that, right? They have very little incentive to invest in understanding this stuff because they're there for a season and a half. They're constantly looking over their shoulder. Admitting that there's something they don't know is impossible because they're paid to know, right? Asking a question, what are you talking about? So unless there's somebody else in the organization they can go to, close the door, and have an open, honest conversation about things they don't actually know, it's a very difficult slog.
So we talked about this a lot on the last year's panel, which is generating that trust. And Devin, you're in a unique place to be doing that and seeing the results from it. How do you generate trust in a coaching staff? How do you develop a relationship that allows your findings and your reports and your suggestions to have weight?
Yeah, I mean, that's a constantly ongoing, I'll call it a battle, right? First, yeah, it's definitely relationship building. A part of that was, at the beginning, just having a common denominator with these people is I'm also a soccer person, right? And being able to translate these ideas into soccer terms, the value of that really can't be understated. But then a lot of, just thinking of kind of the, metric building and reporting stuff side of it, they're looking for a lot of lists that confirm their beliefs, right? And you need to create enough of those regularly so that when that one list comes up, when there's a player that isn't, kind of passing their particular eye test, they know that these other lists you put in front of them made a lot of sense. So now there's something in here on this next time around that, maybe I should, believe him, right? So there's a lot of kind of balancing between confirming their beliefs and building trust and rapport that way. So kind of further down the line, they'll trust you on some other things that may not be as intuitive to them.
How do you deal with an instance in which maybe the information you present in front of them doesn't actually jive on the field? Perhaps a scouting report goes the other way, or how do you maintain the relationship and the trust and move forward in a process when someone may have questions?
Sure. I mean, there has to be a constant back and forth. So, for example, if we had, put together a scouting report that was suggestive that we're expecting this team to play, or your opponent to play in one fashion, you go out on Sunday and they play in a completely different fashion. Why is that, right? And you have to think about it in a couple different ways. Was that because they, just for this particular game, decided to play that way, or was it the way that we played that forced them to play that way, right? So actually understanding this process of how they go from these reports to building game plans to actually on-field performance, and understanding kind of what they're doing there is pretty important, because it gives you kind of that feedback loop. Whereas if we're just throwing these reports at the coaches and they're being thrown in their desks, right, and not doing anything, there's no feedback loop and none of us are learning from it. So yeah, it's all that, making sure that the process is as cyclical as possible and you keep learning from it.
Paul, do you face trust issues with analysts who say, why are you throwing this stat at me? Why should I care? I saw this. I don't need your help to explain it.
I do see a lot of parallels between the way everyone talks about analysts dealing with coaches to the way I deal with producers and especially talent. And I think it's about the relationships, and there's an arc to it of some sort. I can think of early on dealing with someone like Alexi Lawless, where I hear something he's saying while we're watching a game. He's saying, but Ronaldo's really disappearing in the second half, blah, blah, blah. So I'm looking for something to support that. Say, okay, look, Ronaldo had 2 touches in the last 20 minutes of the game. And that makes him look smarter on TV, and it makes him realize, okay, this can be useful. And then what you keep doing that, and what you want to build to is something like at the World Cup in 2014, Roberto Martinez is looking for, or is thinking about how Italy is really struggling in this game, and he knows what we have access to and blah, 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 and he's asking what direction Pirlo is making his passes. We look it up, Pirlo is making whatever it was, 68% of his passes are going backward in this game, and Roberto, that's a clear sign that Italy is literally moving the wrong way too often. And to build that trust in that relationship to where they're coming back to you, pushing for questions and also ideas with what we can do with data, and then they're helping us get smarter because we know how they're thinking, and we're helping them look smarter by backing up their points or maybe trying to change it. I think that's pretty similar to how someone like Devin deals with Toronto management, and it's kind of similar to how all of us in some ways are dealing with the public and kind of growing the analytics. It's like we're showing them things, here's what we can do, and just all the ideas that get out there make everybody smarter, and we all push this whole field forward a little bit.
Blake, something you said to me last night sticks with me when I'm hearing this, and that is questions come before answers. What's that?
I was a few beers in by then.
I think you were serious about this one. Questions before answers. What does that mean to you in the context of analytics and working with clubs?
Questions before answers?
Yeah.
I've touched on it. The ability to try and, in any business, to try and understand the problem first, right? So, a lot of the time I think we used to go away and kind of, lock ourselves in and try and solve our own problems without actually having that connection of understanding what the problem is. So in a very consultative way, whether you're inside a club or come in, you've got that outside view, you come in and you just got to try and understand the problem first, really. So, ability to, I mentioned it earlier, EQ, the emotional intelligence, the ability to really, truly understand the problem. Because then I think if, tactically you were just saying there, Paul, I think, for every 1 point you want to make, try and solve 4 problems. And it kind of hides the fact that you're then pushing that one thing, because, if you're solving problems for the coach or for the owner, and you can also then, it gives you remember when David Moyes first went into Manchester United, I heard him speak, and he was like, I've got to earn the right, he says, I've got to earn the right to build the trust of the fans, or earn the right to build a long-term plan. Obviously, it didn't work out for him, but I found what he said really, really relevant, because, you've got to earn that right, really. So even though you think you might have the best model in the world, or you've got something really compelling, they're just not going to listen to you until you've built that trust and maybe solved a couple of their problems first that are relevant to them. Oh, and by the way, I've got this thing to show you here, which is really compelling and predictive of future success. That conversation is going to go a whole lot better because you've kind of done these 2 or 3 things that are interesting to the audience. So.
Geb, we talked about expected goals, and I think this is a place that we can all focus on. It seems like every Champions League match after it, I see Twitter flooded with expected goal charts. What does that say to you when you see that as a journalist and as someone observing the game and speaking to people in positions of that make decisions and are out there day to day?
Well, I'm always very cautious about this because, yeah, my Twitter feed gets flooded with them because I follow people, one guy in particular who seems to tweet out his expected goals after every game. And then I retweet it, and then I get reactions and whatever else. I don't know to what degree that percolates, in all honesty, to the average fan or the average reader of my columns or the average manager or agent I speak to. I really don't. I still think there's, going back to that disconnect I talked about, I think getting those bridges, as Devin said, winning the trust, getting that buy-in, that remains critical. And maybe in 5 years' time we'll be sitting here and it'll be an accepted stat more so than it is today. I remember though when Arsene Wenger referenced expected goals in a press conference earlier this year, everybody was bowled over and they said, "Oh look, we've achieved legitimacy." Yeah, because it happened that one time, And he's working for a club, by the way, that bought a whole freaking analytics company and's got to justify why they paid millions for it, right?
We'll get to that, maybe why Arsenal doesn't talk about it. Let's more on expected goals, though, Devin. How important is that in your work and what you do? How many models are built around that? How does that affect the reports that you provide the coaching staff?
Expected goals have become pretty standard, right? I think anybody who's doing analytics at a club is using it in some capacity. I don't actually love it as a metric. I think it's got plenty of flaws. And I think of it more, actually, instead of a metric, I think of it as a unit, right? A unit for measuring other things in. So instead of looking at raw expected goals, we might instead be looking at, well, how many expected goals do we create if, you're in this situation or through this phase of play or from this part of the field. I think it's a great framework. As a metric, it falls down a little bit. We use it, of course, but just not really as much in its raw form. I think it's also not an incredibly sophisticated model. I mean, I'm sure that our expected goals model is probably, just as good as a lot of the public ones out there, right? But it's instead how you use that model in creative ways where I think is where we differentiate.
Like how do you use the model?
It underpins a lot of what we do. Again, I just want to make it's so important. I actually hate the phrase expected goals. We love the model, but again, trying to put it into language that your audiences understand. So, is my team over or underachieving at a team level? Is this striker over or underperforming? Was it a fair result? Did we deserve to win the game? These are conversations that fans and boardrooms and coaches are having. So, they just get scared by things that they don't understand. So it's our responsibility to really kind of contextualize them into language that, the football people understand. But, we're using it to help boardrooms probabilistically project where they're going to finish in the league, which obviously has commercial, financial implications. We try and identify over and undervalued players based on, how sustainable their performances are. We use it with investors who are looking at acquiring football clubs. So their context is, is this team over or undervalued potentially? Because you want to know if you're buying a team that's, 5th place in the table, but they're 12th in performance terms, and you think that's going to regress, that has huge financial implications on the valuation of that club. So there's loads of different contexts you can use it in, but I think it's so important to get the language right on these things. The phraseology and how we package them is just so important. And expected goals is quite off-putting, certainly for a lot of the people that we speak to. So.
And I think it's kind of got two uses. I think Blake's talking about how going forward, overachieving players, underachieving players, value, blah blah blah, which is one really good use, and the other use is kind of what Gab mentioned about a post-game thing, where it's a little bit more of it's a reflective thing. It's more of an advanced box score. You start with shots, and then shots on goal is kind of a subset of shots, or another way it's really kind of an advanced metric in a very simplistic way, and expected goals is kind of the next thing. We used a graphic on ESPN. Recently it was an Atletico Madrid game. They won 3-0, but the shots were dead even. So you might think, well, did Atletico get lucky? But the expected goals, it was like Atletico was close to 2, and I think it was Las Palmas was like 0.5. So it was a way of showing, look, now shots are telling us that this was an even game, but the types of shots that they were getting were very different. And so in the isolated single game use, it's much more reflective. And the big picture forward-looking use that you're talking about is much more of a regression one way or the other sort of thing.
And let's not forget that, most expected goals models out there are more predictive of future success than goals and points themselves. And you can't underestimate that that importance. So this isn't just a kind of thing that we've come up with and it's pretty cool and it's a new stat. Trying to explain to people that this thing here will predict where you're going to finish more than the goals that you score is quite a compelling message.
It's not perfect, like Devin says, but it's better than some of the basics.
Yeah.
The reason it's interesting, the reason I think people have gravitated toward it it's because it's simple, it's easy to replicate and do, but it's also fundamentally about the game in that I think there's no other sport, team sport, in which the disjuncture between the result that's achieved and the actual underlying performance of the team can be greater. Because it's the low-scoring nature of the game, remember, is really sort of key to making soccer soccer. So that metric, to me, is really critical because it helps us understand and get our head around the fact we were good, but we lost. Or we were good and we deserved to win. I think, to me, that's why it's interesting. It's a really interesting diagnostic for that.
One of the things that struck me as a layperson, and again, you guys all know much more about this than I do, and maybe somebody has modeled this or come up with a way to model it, but when I look at a lot of these sort of models, when people try to rank the strengths of teams, I get this slight impression that teams that attack more tend to be slightly overvalued. And I couldn't wrap my head around this. And then it occurred to me that we don't take into account, probably because we can't take into account, what the instructions that a team receives when they're 2-0 up, and also the mentality of the players, the culture that they're from, the culture that spawned them. I'm always struck, you watch Bayern Munich play, and a few years ago they played Sporting Lisbon, they won 4-0 away, and in the return leg they won like 6-0 or something, and I come from Italy, no Italian club would do that. At 2-0, if you try to score a third goal, you're kind of a prick, frankly. Like, there's no reason to go, or if the opposition gets a guy sent off, right? You just don't do that. It's not something you do. And I always find this is kind of interesting because in England and in Germany, you show respect to your opponent by continuing to attack once you won the game. In the US, going right back to mercy rules in Little League, you have that code where, you don't steal a base, was after the 5th inning if you're winning by more than X many runs. I don't know if your models take this stuff into account or if there's a way to take it into account or whatever, but I just get the impression, and again, I come at this more from the eye test situation, that score effects, especially in certain leagues, are absolutely huge.
How much are we missing, I guess, is the question to you guys then. What are our limitations? What aren't we seeing? Yeah.
Well, I think, the most goal expectancy models focus on the, what's happening on the ball and they forget the context, right? And we all know football's a dynamic game. So, there are companies in their data sets that can kind of proxy for the context around the situation. So Opta's big chance event gives you a sense of how much space the striker may have at the time that they executed the shot. I think, one of the future things, we're seeing the tracking data coming in now and again becoming fairly available and commoditized. So I think the ability to overlay, they were doing some really cool stuff in the NBA, take inspiration from that, overlay the tracking data onto the Opta or the Prozone data to try and get a sense of, how much the person that was executing the shot was under pressure at the time, how many defenders were around, and what was the context of that situation. So there's loads of space to move into. I mean, in terms of progress, play on words, but loads of new innovations. But again, what we have today, certainly in terms of our version of it and others that I see out there, is already more predictive than goals and points and all the things that we're used to. So, there's that famous saying, isn't there, that all models are wrong, but some are useful, and the goal expectancy, most goal expectancy models are like that because you can predict much more accurately halfway through the season where you're going to finish, what you're going to do in the second half of the season if you use a goal expectancy model rather than goals or points. That's like really, really compelling for me. So we should be kind of continue to progress, but be also really, really happy and celebrate what we've got, because I think football and soccer has been crying out for some of these new age statistics for a while. So I think we've had some real progress in that sense.
But I think there's a real disconnect between a metric like that and what a coach has to do day to day, week to week, to prepare for a game and do his job. It's a very high-level diagnostic. It's 30,000 feet. It's not something that gives you a set of instructions for how we're going to play Tuesday night at whatever to win a football game. And so I think coaches sometimes look at that sort of stuff and say, well, that's nice. I know we created a bunch of good chances, we didn't win, right? Thank you very much. But exactly how should I have played different guys in different ways? How should I have set up? What about this? What about that? So at the very micro level, it's a very macro kind of thing, metric. At the micro level, it doesn't help the coach actually do his job that we ask him to do.
So like a diagnostic.
Yeah.
It's
like a blood test.
We always fondly, like our our performance league is like a no bullshit filter. So, you know, you want to play like Bayern Munich, you want to play at Barcelona, you want to play like West Brom, you know, whatever. That's kind of comes down to the philosophy of the club, the style of the manager. But every team wants to score and not concede goals. So you can just have a really objective conversation around, you know, your chance creation. You know, teams like, I don't know, Swansea perhaps a couple of years ago, keeping the ball, looking really pretty, great style of play, but were they actually creating, you know, effective chances in the, you know, in the final third? So it becomes a debate then around style and substance. And there's some teams that are able to beat the system by not playing that pretty, but actually producing results, and vice versa. So I think it just becomes a really nice metric that can kind of travel across all leagues, and you just have this no bullshit conversation around, okay, irrespective of the way you want to play football, whatever your style and philosophy is, what is our output in both attack and defense? And I just think it's a really nice, clean conversation. It taps into every single post-match interview that you have, or with a coach or a manager will go, oh, you know, I thought we played well today, created good chances, but we didn't quite get the result we deserved. Right, here's a statistic that can measure that for you. It's a diagnostic. Doesn't necessarily tell you, you know, why, but it tells you kind of what happened more objectively, and then you can start tapping into, well, if we're not producing great chances, goal expectancy, let's get back on the training field and play around with that philosophy, because perhaps it needs to be adapted. So that's then the application.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking back to what Chris was saying about, you know, micro versus macro uses of it. And the example I always talk about regarding kind of the biases in the, you know, expected goals conversation is the great Carly Lloyd goal in the World Cup, right? If you ran that through any of our expected goals models, it's going to be a 1 in 500 chance, right? But actually the fact that she looks up and she sees that opportunity, and that she decides to attempt that shot already shows that there's more than just a 1 in 500 chance of making that, right? So these very basic models don't really account for some of these cognitive biases that are kind of involved. And, you know, this is also kind of a reason why you'll see a lot of expected goals under predicting, right? Because they don't really doesn't take into account the decisions that the player actually made to take that shot.
We've talked a lot about expected goals. Let's move on to something I don't think is necessarily in wide use or maybe effective use, and that's player scouting and acquisitions. Blake, I'll start with you there. I mean, between opposition scouting and self-evaluation and actually going out on the market and finding players, what's the split like? Are we effectively able to identify players that clubs should go after? Can they actually implement this in their transfer policy to a great degree?
Yeah, so we're doing a bunch of stuff in this area. You know, most of our business is kind of focused on either managing the player portfolio or, you know, or acquiring new kind of assets or talent. So, I mean, the reality is we're not very good at it, right? I don't mean us, obviously we're amazing at it, but the industry generally is not very good at, you know, acquiring a talent. It's hard in any business, especially, you know, you're dealing with humans. But, you know, the data says that, you know, there's different ways of measuring success, right? You can look at first appearances, return on investment. But if you look at kind of the minutes played in the first team for new players relative to core players, then, you know, new players brought into the team tend to play less than core players in the team. So then you go, right, well, you know, the grass is always greener. Why don't we just try and make best use of the talent that we have? But when I look at recruitment, I kind of broadly break it down into kind of search and due diligence. So I think analytics really, really helps on the search side. So you can kind of profile what you're looking for, what attributes, both in terms of the soft and hard skills. Try and profile and measure that as best you can. And then there's some, great tools that you can use, whether it's kind of principal component analysis cluster, trying to find similar players, to what your profile is looking for, and really just kind of widen the net, in a very efficient way where you're not sending people out and watching loads of videos and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really efficient way to search for new talent and open up new opportunities. But then on the due diligence side, it's probably less about analytics, but it's more around just some simple tools to say no sometimes. So irrespective of whether your search, where your model has produced, some suggestions to look at, or a scout or a coach who said, hey, I'm really keen on this player. You can just create like a checklist of just really simple business intelligence tools around the age profile, the suitability, the cultural fit, and in a very simple way, get a score out of 10 or whatever in terms of how much that's a good business decision as well as a playing style fit. So analytics for me, opening up new opportunities in terms of search, and then just some really simple tools like a filter process on due diligence to go, actually he looked good on the data or when we saw that player, but when we took into account these things that are relevant to our club, we decided to say no. And so, yeah, we're working a lot in that space, and I think there's a whole ton of opportunities on the recruitment side.
Chris and Devin, does this come into play in your jobs? Do you use this in any?
I would never admit to that. I think what's interesting about our situation to me is how far removed it is from the Premier League, from the top leagues of European football. There's plenty of data on a global market for players, lots of information to sift through. At our level, it's very much a domestic player market. It's very much a player market that involves a lot of loan signings. It's a player market that happens very much in the confines of the village that is English football. And so numbers are helpful for post hoc, just making sure the guy's got 2 legs and 2 arms and he's all right. And most of the recruitment decisions revolve around personal relationships and understanding the dynamics of other teams where there might be an opportunity to pick somebody up who's not getting playing time, understanding sort of the ins and outs of the isotope that is English club football. That's very different, and data don't play a huge role in that. On the due diligence side, yes, to some extent. It's probably more interesting for me at my level to sort of make sure that I have a sense of, are we on track? How our performance is comparing to where we need to be? How does that play into where we think we want to be given our budget and that kind of stuff at a high level?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're a little bit different, but I think there's, if you're signing a player purely on analytics, you're obviously doing it wrong. What analytics can do is make your transfer policy more efficient, right? There's a remarkable amount of ways that you can screw a transfer up, right? And if you are great at finding these players and then valuing these players, but you then can't sign them to an appropriate contract, then you've blown away all this other efficiency you had upstream in your kind of funnel of players. So it's not just about finding the best players or valuing the best players. It's also kind of picking where you can integrate yourself into that process where you can make the largest amount of difference.
We have about 15 minutes left. I'll go to some of the questions. Remember, #SoccerAnalytics. Chris, we'll start with you. I thought this was interesting. If you wrote your book again, how would you explain Leicester City's amazing run this season? Good luck.
Boy.
Or maybe that's a chapter that's coming. Who knows?
I wouldn't. I have to ask Dave Sally, who's sitting over there. Maybe Dave has an idea. I think I would explain it in a couple of different ways. First of all, they've had a really good recruitment department for a number of years, and that's kind of one of the underreported stories of I think, Leicester City's success. Some of those guys have been hired away to other bigger clubs, so I think they've had a very good recruitment policy. There has been some money spent in Leicester by the owners, significant money over the years from the Championship up to the Premier League. I would also say that Jamie Vardy is probably having the kind of season that he will never have again, unfortunately. But it's just the right time, just the right year for him to have that kind of season. And Gabriele will know more about Claudio Ranieri. He is an experienced man who's been around. He's been in this league before. Doesn't get too excited about things. So you've got a lot of ingredients of things that are going right for them. So probably a one-off, I'd say.
We'll move on to Gab, one for you. What can you use in your work to better explain these things to the average fan? We've talked a lot about that disconnect. How do you connect the gap? Do you want to connect the gap in
In
your
my
work?
media work,
Yeah.
honestly, I don't know how to code, so I'm useless. What you said before about you would recruit people who know how to code. I ask myself questions. The times I've done basic things, I've sat there and I've literally added things up, and then I know how to use a calculator, and I know how to come up with ideas, but I don't have anybody who can code and scrape the data and come up with a solution for me. So I just leave it to other people.
Do you borrow other people's work? Does it help you tell stories in your research and your back-end process, even if you're not the one actually crunching the numbers?
Yeah, no, I try to read a lot about it, and I'll reference stuff, but it's also like the kind of questions that I pose myself, I can't answer because I can't code. So I just run into a brick wall there.
Let's talk a little bit about long-term planning, Blake, and what exactly you're being asked for in that sense, because I think the investment side is really interesting, what investors want. And we've seen so many different groups come in from China, from the Middle East, Americans in the Premier League, all over the place. What makes a football club a good investment? How do you tell that story?
Okay, so there used to be, as part of the due diligence process of an investor buying a club, we kind of discovered, we're fairly new to this, but we discovered there's the legal side and the financial side historically. But then we realized there was a bit of a gap around. No one was in fact, Dave and Chris had done some, but there weren't many people who were looking specifically at the playing squad. And as we know, the players are the biggest assets or liability that the club has. So it seemed strange to us, as I'm sure it did to these guys, that that was a piece that was kind of missing really. So we've collaborated on a few projects recently. Ian Lynham sat over there. We recently were involved with Ian on the Everton deal that closed. And we take a look at the squad and the performance in a number of areas, but obviously make it relevant to that audience. So, looking at the performance of the team and the players, as I alluded to earlier, is this an overvalued or an undervalued team? What's the sustainability in the performance? Looking at the profile of the squad, so age profiles, peak performance, the life cycle of the squad. Are we buying a club? But then we've also got to go and buy a new squad, depending on the contractual dependency of the players that are playing. We'll look at the track record of the incumbent people at the club in terms of recruitment and youth development. So is this a developing club? Is it a buying club? And then we'll look at the front office efficiency as well. So talking again, going back to the actual uses of models like goal expectancy, can we have a look at the performance of the goal expectancy, the performance of the team relative to resources? Because you then might pick up some signals around, are they getting the most from, are they overachieving relative to the value of the squad? So you can see how some of that stuff could be used in a valuation context. It goes alongside the legal due diligence and the financial due diligence. So, ultimately the investor's looking at, can we get the most accurate valuation from the club, and can we mitigate against any risk? And that's ultimately what it comes down to.
Can you evaluate coaches well using advanced analytics, Chris? Is this something that you think is possible, or is there a gap there?
It's really, really hard. You try to, of course. Try to look at. It's easier to do with coaches who've had some longevity. So if you look at David Moyes' record at Everton, for instance, right? You have a number of years. Sort of the wage budgets. You can kind of see, you can run a regression, see if he's over or underachieving. You can do some of that kind of stuff. The trouble, as some managers have reminded me, with that is, of course, the short tenure of most people's jobs. And of course, every manager inherits a squad that's very difficult to change. So they inherit a set of players that were hired by somebody else to play a different style of football. And you've got maybe a window or two to reshape the squad pretty quickly to your liking to produce some results. And there's a sort of a 50-50 on whether that's actually going to work. and before you know it, you're out of a job again, you're looking again. Does that mean that he's a bad manager, he's a bad head coach? I don't think so necessarily. It's very hard to know, so then you get into much more qualitative kind of work and due diligence that you have to do. I think the key is not so much are they over underachieving relative to some metric. I think the key on finding a good head coach is whether they have the right skill set for the club and the situation that you require in that moment in time. There is no objectively best manager that for my football club or any football club. I think if you put Jose Mourinho at Scunthorpe, I don't know how well that would go. So there has to be a really good match between skill and need, and that's really, at the end of the day, the trick.
Well, Jose says July he'll have a new job, so we'll look out for Scunthorpe on that sense. Devin, is there a position that you find easiest to evaluate? Are there certain spots in the field, styles of players that lend themselves more to the data that you have and your models and your ability to collect?
That's a tough question. I'd probably say it's pretty easy to evaluate attacking ability, right? And I think the data makes it very difficult to do the defensive side, right? It's harder to create kind of robust models there. And it's not as simple as just flipping your attacking models on its head and saying, you know, if this guy's creating this, that means these other guys are conceding this. It's more sophisticated than that. But as, you know, as the data gets better and better, and you know, we'll be able to build more robust defensive measures.
Blake, you mentioned positional tracking. How will that change and the widespread use of that and increased research into that change the way all of you guys do your jobs? What will that advance?
Yeah, like I said, I think it'll just add more context, right? Because we all know that a lot of the data available is kind of on the ball stuff, but I think because of that, we often focus on the individual and forget the context. And as we all know, that's why football, why soccer is so unique, because it's quite a fluid, dynamic game. So I guess it will enable us, like they've done in the NBA, to start kind of understanding and contextualizing the performance of defenders in particular. So there's been some brilliant work. Luke, I don't know if he's in the room, Luke Bourne and those guys at Harvard, and who were kind of able to, you know, understand how much defenders in basketball were able to disrupt, you know, the offensive players. So, you know, if you can imagine the tracking data in football, seeing how much, for example, a defender had ownership of certain players, you know, in the game, how much they were pressing them to put pressure on them to stop them from doing the stuff that we're kind of measuring at the moment. So yeah, again, I think it's a cool time. I think it will enable us to measure things that we've never been able to do before. Again, there's always limitations, right? So I think, you know, the Premier League have just put cameras in all the Premier League stadiums. I think they're already in Germany and Spain, but you know, I'm not sure the technology will travel as much as some of the Opta and the Prozone data has. So there'll always be limitations in terms of data sets. But yeah, I think certainly on the defensive contribution, I think the tracking data will open up a world of opportunity, because that remains, you know, you go back to those stories about Ferguson not having the data he needed to measure Jaap Stam's contribution, for example. And I think it will enable us to start measuring those guys.
So we just have a few minutes left. I'll pose it to you guys. What's next? Next year, what will we be talking about? What will be the touch points? What are you looking at in your own jobs as you look to advance what you're doing and move forward in the next year? Devin, let's just start down at the end with you.
Sure. I mean, it's tough. I think, you know, I'm always keeping an eye out on you know, what the public sphere is doing, right? And it's accelerating, and it's, you know, there's more and more out there every single day. So it's, you know, hard to keep track of them. But, you know, as long as that keeps going in the fashion it is right now, it's really, I think, hard to predict where we'll be. And that's more on the technical end. I think, you know, the major, you know, places of, you know, immediate impact is more on just more and more analysts getting into clubs in positions of consequence, and, you know, are, creating as much kind of value there, and, you know, gaining more and more trust. And that's gonna be hard to see from the outside, right? But I think that's ultimately healthy for, you know, the kind of entire industry.
I'll open it up to all you guys. Jump in if you have something. Crowd's getting a little restless there.
And I think on the media standpoint, it's keep pushing. Just like I said, we've kind of been pushing for several years, and this goes at ESPN at least for every sport. You know, we're not just putting numbers out there or stats or analytics out there for the sake of doing it. We find the ones that tell these stories or give analysts and talent something to react to the best, and that's when it works. So we as researchers and people who have access to this data and understand it a little better just have to keep pushing, whether it's things we already have like expected goals or it's whatever's next. We have to educate ourselves, stay educated, and then figure out the most concise, simplest way to present it to talent and to present it on television.
I think there's the next, or one of maybe the next big leap forwards will come when we have more, and I have a particular interest in the transfer market and how that works. But when we have, if we ever have more transparency and more legality, once you start moving in the world of agents and intermediaries and the people who make buying and selling decisions at the club, you realize how incredibly inefficient and sometimes corrupt the system is. So, you know, when you guys were talking about recruiting before, you guys can, you know, identify and scout and so on, and you have an idea of how much a player makes, and we can offer him this much more, and that we can, you know, but it all goes out the window when either your data is bad because you're getting bad input, or when you're dealing with a range of crooks on the other side. And unfortunately, that's something that we're seeing. Third-party investment has not gone away and still exists. It's creeping into MLS as well, as you guys probably know. And, you know, I think those are all things that can distort, that can inflate. And if we get more transparency, I think you guys will probably all be able to do your job a little bit better and more efficiently.
Anything from Chris or Blake before we get this done?
One of the more interesting things that is happening out there is has to do with the transfer market, notwithstanding the corruption or the corrupt element of it. You see more and more agents now turning to numbers to help shape deals. It's one of the interesting things that's happened in the last, I want to say, 12 to 18 months, whether you now have more sort of data-based, evidence-based conversations about players and deals and what they should be earning and shouldn't be earning. From both sides, both from the club side and from the player side. It's still, of course, the absolute exception to the rule, but you see more and more of it. And so I think that would probably accelerate, which is probably good news for people looking to get into the business, because there's a million agents out there, and they might need some help.
Blake?
Lot more use of data in player representation, club-based negotiations. We're involved in some of that, and it's happening more and more. I think there'll be a lot more differentiation between the role of the analyst versus the video analyst versus the data scientist, which can only be good for you guys. Changing ownership structure, so a lot more US investment certainly coming into Europe. I think will open up a whole world of opportunities for North American-based analysts wanting to work in Europe. Tracking data we've already discussed, and there's some great research as well, and again, the tracking data will help on this in terms of trying to understand and measure kind of the intelligence levels of players, which is an area that fascinates me, and there's some amazing research that's coming out of Sweden at the moment in terms of being able to measure kind of game intelligence and executive functions, and I think that's going to change the game in terms of trying to measure the intelligence of players on the pitch. So yeah, there's a few things that we're involved in that we think is really exciting.
Well, thank you guys for your insights here. Thank you all for sitting with us. Enjoy the rest of the panels in the conference, everyone. Thank you.